Hello, this is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. You know, I've never been too interested in people talking on the internet about their personal and family situations. And now, what am I doing? I want to tell you about my grandfather, who was a pioneer in Western Canada. And he had lots of adventures. He wrote a substantial diary because he sensed that he was living in a substantial, important time of the country. He joined the Northwest Mounted Police in the early days. He was one of the policemen who escorted Sitting Bull after Custer's last stand. He escorted Sitting Bull back across the American line. He patrolled the notorious Whoop-Up Trail of Western Canada, southern Alberta. So come and join us. I divided the video into two parts. The first part tells about Ed's experiences going from Ontario to Fort Walsh, Saskatchewan, where he served as a Northwest Mounted Policeman. And the second video talks about his experiences after the police force when he became one of the first pioneers in the Lacombe area of central Alberta. This sketch map shows where Ed started on his trip from Almonte, just south of Ottawa, Ontario, through the Great Lakes, across this part of the U.S., north to Winnipeg, and across the Great Plains of Western Canada, served with the Northwest Mounted Police in Fort Walsh, and made his way eventually to Lacombe, Alberta. Let's start with a quote from Ed's diary. I was born and raised in the town of Almonte, Ontario. Almonte is just out of Ottawa, Ontario, near where the Ottawa Senators play their NHL hockey these days. But Almonte's a beautiful town with waterfalls and rapids flowing right through the center part of the town. It was a wool fabric manufacturing town with power supplied by the waterfalls in town. But there was a little exciting about the idea of staying in Almonte to work a lifetime in the wool mills, where work was hard and routine. Ed wrote of his feelings back then. I turned toward the west. John A. Macdonald was then Prime Minister of Canada, chiefly tangled up with the Canadian Pacific Railway, Indian troubles, and political opposition. This map shows Ed's travel from Ottawa, Almonte, where he started, and he made his way over to Winnipeg, Manitoba. But he couldn't go overland because there were no roads in those days. Ed therefore traveled by boat through the Great Lakes, down to Chicago, and across this part of the U.S. and north to Winnipeg. Ed started out on his trip from Lake Ontario. We shipped out on a sunny Sunday morning. The boat was loaded with boxes, trunks, and immigrants of every description. The noise was terrific. Babies cried, roosters crowed, and dogs barked. The passengers were talking in a dozen different languages. After a few days out, the swish of water from the creaking paddle wheel and the constant pounding of the engines began to get uninteresting. An occasional stop to climb up red clay banks and pack wood on my back broke the monotony. So he traveled by boat down Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, then swung north to Lake Huron. He worked on the boat for part of his passage as the boat swung south through Lake Michigan. And he got into Chicago about half a dozen years after Mrs. O'Leary's cow in the barnyard kicked over a lantern, and it burned down a big part of Chicago, over 2,000 acres. It destroyed 14,000 buildings. It left 90,000 people homeless, and it had killed around 250 people. So Chicago was in the recovery phase still. But the Americans had built railways in this part of the country. When Ed caught the train out of Chicago, he was impressed with the beauty of the country, but he ran into an experience that made him quickly change his mind. Ed made this note in his diary as he left Chicago and caught the train toward the Mississippi River. Talking to one of the train crew, he told me that there was a ranch close to the next station, and it shouldn't be difficult to get a job, as there was always a demand for help in those isolated regions. Taking his advice, I dropped off at the next station, the train pulled out, and I was left alone. I decided to walk a quarter of a mile to some ranch buildings and loosen up my joints after the long, tiresome train ride. There seemed to be no one around the house, so I strolled over to the barn to have a look around. To my horror, I saw 3 scalped men lying dead near the barn. The ghastly sight nauseated me, and I made a hasty retreat back to the station. Ed continued to write in his diary the following: "Sleeping alone that night in the station was a nightmare, even though I securely locked the door and covered the window. However, this did not allay my fears throughout the dark night. I now decided that the United States was too wild and dangerous a country for me. Canada seemed much safer." Winnipeg in 1877 was a one-street town, and Ed wrote, "There were no sidewalks, and after a rain, it was a common sight to see carts stuck on the one main street. People were buying up land, hoping they could make a fortune if they could guess where the railway would cross the river." Ed rode his saddle horse across the western plains and wrote of watching one of the last great bison hunts and experiencing the wrath of a prairie wildfire. Ed met 3 policemen with the newly formed National Northwest Mounted Police Force, and they had just escorted a prisoner to Winnipeg's Stony Mountain Penitentiary, and they were riding back to headquarters in Fort Walsh, Saskatchewan. They invited Ed to come along and join the police force, and it was an opportunity Ed could not pass up. They saddled up in Winnipeg and rode their horses 1,000 kilometers westward to Fort Walsh, where Ed signed up. They rode the same trail the first police force had taken a couple of years earlier, and it was called the Red Coat Trail, a tourist trail that you can drive today. I took these bison photos at a bison roundup for anthrax vaccinations one time. Ed and his 3 new police companions saw a similar bison roundup on their way out west. He wrote the following about it: "From the hills were occasional flashes of light from the scouts signaling to the hunters in the valley below. A large herd of buffalo was being pursued directly below us. 100 Indians were in hot pursuit of over 1,000 buffalo, whose massive heads swung wildly. Terrific snorts and hammering hooves scattered swirling clouds of dust." Thundering along, these maddened, fear-crazed animals seemed to lose all sense of direction. They were easy targets for the yelling, pursuing Indians who stuck to their horses as though glue to their seats. Many Indians stayed outside the main herd, shooting arrows in what seemed an aimless fashion. Buffalo stumbled and fell. Sometimes a rider and horse went down. Some Indians were strung out for a mile behind the main herd, finishing off the buffalo that were crippled. Many of the riders now dismounted to complete the work of killing. Far to the rear, the women and children moved in with their travois and started cutting up the meat. The rough, shaggy buffalo hides were eventually prized by the traders. Meat was pounded into pemmican for winter. Little was wasted except the bones. Many of the buffalo horns would be worn by some chief or medicine man. Wildfire was always a danger on the prairies, and the wildfires were caused by lightning or maybe sparks from the train. And the Americans had set wildfires across the western plains to stop the buffalo from migrating north. And if the buffalo migrated north, it was food for the Indian folks. But the Lakota Sioux had fled north across the border after the Custer's last stand, and they had annihilated the 7th Cavalry. So to get back at them, they set fires across the western plains to stop the buffalo from migrating, and hence the food supply was short in Canada for everyone. Ed and his companions got caught in one of these prairie fires, and Ed described it in his diary. A red glare at sunset to the northwest raised our suspicions. On came the fire, which could be heard roaring in the distance. There was much excitement in our haste to keep our horses from stampeding. A herd of deer raced by with glaring eyes and distended nostrils, fear lending wings to their feet. Wolves shot by, and we heard thundering hoofs of a buffalo herd. I will never forget the sight of those poor, frightened beasts with lowered heads, frothing at the mouth and running in a blind frenzy. They passed, and many plunged into the lake. The fire was all around us, but we were safe. We had saved some feed for our horses. The stampeding animals did not linger long, and we were soon alone again in the midst of a burned-out desolation. Ed served in the Northwest Mounted Police in Fort Walsh, Saskatchewan, and later on in Fort Macloed in Alberta. This is the visitor center at Fort Walsh, a National Historic Park today, and where major events occurred that contributed to Canada becoming a successful country. And my grandfather was around at that time. Ed wrote the following about his police experiences. Major Sam Steele was then drill instructor, and it was his duty to train us in the art of horsemanship. Since we were all fresh from the east, clerks, timbermen, laborers, and so on, it was no easy task to train us. The first few weeks in the force consisted of drill, marching, horsemanship, target practice, and guard duty. Then following training in posting diaries and charging persons caught violating the law. There was dangerous and exciting duties too. We had to learn to ride long distances in all kinds of weather and find our way. Often we were chilled to the bone by rains, plagued by swarming mosquitoes and flies, and soaked when fording rivers and streams. We faced cold weather and prairie blizzards. Often we had to get out logs and put up buildings, dig wells, build corrals, and put up hay for the horses. The code of the force was constantly and forcefully impressed on us. Our first and greatest duty was to protect the Indians, as fur protects a beaver. We had to first understand his background and nature. To abuse him was to make him a lifelong enemy. Treated kindly and justly, he became a steadfast, lifelong friend. A horse was the most valuable present you could give to him. His greatest shortcoming was his predilection for firewater. He would part with anything he owned for it. Whiskey smugglers knew well this weakness and took advantage of it. Our principal problems were Indian unrest and uprisings over the rapid disappearance of the buffalo and their chief source of food, preventing the sale of whiskey, firewater to Indians by whiskey smugglers, and running down and bringing to justice cattle and horse thieves. This is one of the characteristically white pointed tents on display at Fort Walsh today. And these are some historic photos of the tents that the police used often when they were on patrol. Ed rode a lot of patrols and tells of the story of one out by Old Wives Lake. We're along the shores of Old Wives Lake in southern Saskatchewan here. And my grandfather was there, and he tells a story of the elderly women who were left by this lake in their old age. Ed wrote in his diary, "The lake takes its name from the Indians. It was here they left their old women to die, as they could not keep up with the rapidly moving bands. I saw a number of these old women, crippled and completely worn out." Negotiations were finalized to have Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux return to the U.S. And Ed writes in his diary, "I had the pleasure of being one of the escort of police to hand Sitting Bull over to the American soldiers. Sitting Bull was very sedate as he sat on his cayuse, his legs almost reaching the ground. They were peaceful and moved along quietly. The Americans were in readiness to meet them at the line, about 400 strong. Papers were exchanged, the general signs of courtesy were advanced and accepted. The Americans swung in between us and the Indians and bunched them like sheep in a compact body. The last I saw of Sitting Bull, he was stretched as high as he could, roaring at the top of his voice, prevailing his people to go quietly and give no trouble." Fort Walsh is a National Historic Site visited by a lot of people today. It's a pretty good-sized operation, and you can take a tour of it. They have guides there. This is a model of the thing with the barracks and eating places and sleeping places. I'm just in the middle of it right now, and we'll just do a little scan around looking at the various buildings. There were supplies in them, and there was an anvil shop, and as well as the normal eating and sleeping areas. This was a photo of Major Walsh in one of the meeting halls. These are some pictures inside some of the buildings. Word came that they were moving the headquarters from Fort Walsh over to Alberta to Fort Macloed, and Ed wrote in his diary, "With regret, we said goodbye to our friends of those venturesome days and pulled out the last of September. We vanished into the morning air, many of us never to see Fort Walsh again. After an eventful trip of 10 days, we arrived at Fort Macloed, a beautiful spot on the banks of the Old Man River." The Northwest Mounted Police moved their headquarters from Fort Walsh over in Saskatchewan, over to the east here, over to Fort Macloed in Alberta. And Fort Macloed was just upstream from present-day Lethbridge. And just south of Lethbridge today, downstream on the Old Man River, was Fort Whoop-Up, the notorious fort that brought in supplies which included whiskey, which turned Indian culture upside down. All of the supplies in those days came by bull train or wagons pulled by mules. About 200 kilometers from the south, from Fort Benton in Montana. And the trail from Fort Benton up to Fort Whoop-Up was called the Whoop-Up Trail. Ed continued his diary about Fort Macloed. He wrote, "Up to this time, Macloed had not made much headway as a fort, for there was a lot to do in the way of completion, and the heavy-duty chasing whiskey traders, horse and cattle thieves, and desperadoes generally did not give much time for duty in the completion of a fort. The fort site on an island in the river had been selected by Jerry Potts. Flooding in the river forced moving the fort from the island to in town where it is today along the highway. Tourists visit Fort Macloed. They have an interesting historic district, and the fort and museum offer police musical rides." Ed added to his diary in Fort Macloed. He wrote, "Everything was brought in through the U.S. from Fort Benton by bull train or mule outfits. These outfits consisted of 3 wagons to a train. It was no uncommon sight to see trains 2 miles long. Crossing rivers was the greatest danger to these outfits, as they sometimes got to milling in the center of the stream, and a complete train of 3 wagons and mules could be lost. The buffalo, the chief supply of the Indians, was vanishing owing to the depredations of the buffalo hunter and whiskey trader that was constantly drifting in and out from the south. Bull trains began rolling in loaded with provisions from Fort Benton. The Indians began coming in from the plains and making demands for provisions, camping along the Old Man River in thousands. Their teepees stretched for miles. The constant pounding of the tom-tom carried with it a fear of uneasiness. However, the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police was equal to the occasion. Ed left the Northwest Mounted Police at Fort Macloed, loaded his stuff in a wagon, and headed north for the Red Deer Lacombe area of Alberta. And that story is in part 2 of these 2 videos that I made on his life. To find that other video, just Google it. As it says on the bottom here, the little @ Don Barnett 5090, click my name, hit playlists and scroll down to the Alberta, Saskatchewan playlists, either one. And hit the subscribe button. That'll tell you when we're putting more videos back here up on the internet.